Howdy everybody, this is Omar, your Audio Amigo, here today with yet another Audio Amigo review for you guys. Today we're going to be looking at the top of the heap for TRN's ocean-themed IEM line. These are the TRN Jaws, a $120 Tribrid IEM featuring 3 dynamic drivers, 4 balanced armatures, and an annular planar driver. You've got the Orca, the Conch, the Medusa, the Shell. Does the Jaws earn its spot as the king of the ocean? Well, it's time to find out. As usual, quick disclaimer, this particular unit of the Jaws was sent to me by Aoshida Audio for review. I'm not being paid for this review, but because I could turn around and sell these if I wanted to, I've gone ahead and activated the paid promotion feature here on YouTube. I do these disclaimers because I believe in full transparency when there's potential bias besides my own personal taste at play. Thank you so much to Aoshida Audio for sending me this set, and thanks to all of you for your continued support. So, the TRN Conch, the second cheapest IEM in the family, has one of the best accessories packages under $40 in my opinion. So you would expect the King of the Sea to sort of match that energy, and it kind of does. In addition to the IEMs and the cable, you also get a USB C dongle, which is always a good thing to see. You get a carry case with a lanyard strap, which again, I like to see. And then you get 4 sets of ear tips. You get foams, you get white sort of silicone standard tips, you get black silicone standard tips and a slightly narrower bore, and you get a full set of TRN's premium T-tips. Each of these come in their own little plastic carrier with the TRN logo on them, which is quite nice. Overall, this is pretty good. The carry case, if I'm being completely honest, is a bit of a disappointment. It's definitely crush resistant, but the inside is hard plastic and isn't exactly what I would call soft. This plastic coating is slightly soft, but I don't think that this will protect the IEMs from scratches or impacts as much as if it was like a softer coating on the inside. This is also the same type of case that I've seen on IEMs in the like $40, $50 range, things like the QKZX HVB Hades. So I personally was expecting something a little nicer. It is cool that the tips all come in individual carry cases, but it's a bit of a bummer that they're open at the sides, which means that any dust or debris can get in there, and especially for these T-tips, get things a bit dirty. It is a nice accessories package overall. There are some things I wish would have been included, but I'm going to say it's a mixed bag overall. Let's take a quick look at those cables, starting with the USB C dongle here. Little lightweight. It's a bummer that the cable here doesn't match the cable itself, but I mean, it's nice that it's included. It does power the IEMs perfectly, plenty of room, headroom for volume if you like to listen a little bit louder. TRN logo on there, drawn, not stamped USB connector, which is all I can really ask for. Including a dongle is always a good thing. As far as the cable itself goes, it's quite nice. It's got this sort of plastic sheathing over cloth thing going on. It feels really smooth and nice in the hands. Maybe a little bit rubbery, but it still has that premium feel to it. No microphonics, no real memory to speak of. It behaves very well. The hardware is all matching, and it's this sort of really nice sandblasted... Oop, dropped a 3.5 there. It's all this really nice sandblasted metal look here. You get the Jaws logo on the 3.5 connector here. You get the TRN logo on the Y-split. The chin slider works very well with the coating on those wires. It stays in place and it sits flush against the Y-split, which y'all know I care about. The 2-pin connectors have that little indent on them that makes it easy to grab onto whenever you're swapping the cable. It also makes for very easy right and left stereo identification. The ear hooks themselves are quite comfortable. They're not crinkly or anything. It feels really nice. Overall, this is a really nice cable. I really dig the machined look on all the hardware. My only complaint here is that basically every other Ocean Series IEM, starting with the Conch and up, has modular sort of amp connections here. It's a bit of a head scratcher that this cable doesn't have it, but you know, other than that, I'd say very solid cable overall. But now let's have a look at the IEMs themselves. As you can see, these are full resin lower shells with metal nozzles glued into the end. You can actually see the wire for the 2 BAs that are in the nozzle going through there, which is always cool. The nozzles feature a metal mesh on the end to protect from debris, and are not swappable, which again goes contrary to most of the other IEMs in this family. There are 2 vents on sort of the inside here. You get one above the sort of 6mm driver there, and you get another one above the, or right next to it for the rear volume. Because of that ventilation, I didn't really have any issues with driver flex or pressure buildup with these, so no real problem. The back panel is allegedly vented. I don't know how much of this is actually exposed to the rear drivers of the or to the rear volume of the drivers here, but I didn't get any sound bleed through this in my testing, so don't worry about sort of sharing your music with others. Yeah, other than that, I can't make out any extraneous use of glue on any of the drivers in here. It doesn't seem like there's really any flaws in the build quality. You can see where the faceplate is sort of adhered to the lower shells here. That would be a point of failure, having the faceplate pop off, but honestly, they feel pretty good for the price in terms of build. I think they'll be about as reliable as other IEMs of this construction. All right, time to talk specs. The Jaws here are essentially the TRN Shell, but they've gone ahead and added 4 extra balanced armatures into the mix. So you have the 3-driver stack consisting of a 10.5mm beryllium driver, a 8mm PET driver, and a 6mm annular planar, sort of all in a coaxial arrangement. And then off to the side, you have a 6mm titanium diaphragm dynamic driver, same as the Shell in that regard. The Jaws, however, adds in a pair of 50060 balanced armatures for the upper mids, as well as 2 30095 balanced armatures in the nozzle for treble. You would think that 8 drivers would be kind of hard to push, but nope. This was actually one of the easier IEMs to drive in my collection, and you would be fine using whatever source you have, and they include the dongle, which honestly is perfectly adequate for this use. Just use that. TRN is using a 6-way crossover here, so this does change sound with impedance adapters. We'll talk about that later. The weight on these is well controlled, and adding the cable puts the in-pocket weight of this whole set at 34.5 grams, which is pretty nice. The nozzles are under the 6mm mark, and that combined with the more modest weight of the shell should make these nice and comfy, which also we'll talk about later. But now it's time for the cool wall. The Jaws is a pretty interesting design. I really like clear resin like this. It lets me see all the little details of the build. You can see the wires going to all the drivers. You got your 2 BAs there. You can see the little channel for the audio, that little gap right there. These BAs don't have nozzles, so those slots are where the sound comes out. You can see the channel for the sound for the 6mm titanium driver there. I like that. It feels good to me. I generally like that sort of thing. My main issue with the design of these is these faceplates. They just feel a little low rent to me. For 120, 130 bucks, this seems like something that TRN would put on one of their more budget-oriented IEMs. I just wish they had taken a little bit more time to maybe make this metal instead of plastic, make it feel a bit more special. So yeah, I mean, really cool internals, but in the ear, you're not going to see any of that. You're just going to see what looks like a sort of low-rent faceplate. So for that reason, these are going to go in bland. Maybe I'm being a bit mean to them. I just don't think they look all that special unless you're looking at the side that you're never going to see. All right, the Council of Ladies is going to be a little bit different today. Just like in sports, we've had to substitute a player in. So playing the part of lady number 2 today will be our first alternate lady. So let's see how she mixes up the council and what they think of the Jaws. We start off with a split verdict that leans positive in terms of if these are pretty or not. We have 2 yeses, 2 mehs, and a single no. It'll be interesting to see how those translate to compliments, and it looks like it's a 3-2 against the giving out of compliments, with lady number 3 and our substitute lady number 2 willing to shell out compliments for you wearing these. Finally, here are their thoughts, and it's a bit of a mixed bag. The ladies who like these seem pretty positive about them, overall good things to say, but the rest of the thoughts are kind of bland, kind of negative, I would say. Like me, I think they were a bit split on the Jaws, but overall, I'd say the sentiment really isn't that bad. It's just a little bit boring overall for them. Let's chat about comfort. The shell design on the Jaws here are extremely standard. This is your sort of basic sort of IEM bean shape, no wings, protrusions, bulges, valleys, or any sort of odd comfort feature that might not work for you. These slotted into my ears very easily, and the lightweight and moderate-sized nozzles meant hours of wear with absolutely no discomfort or pain. I think it's a really good design. As far as my wife goes, these earned a technical pass on the tiny ears test. The lack of wings or bulges means that she could get them deep enough to form and maintain a good seal, and the seal didn't end up failing with speech or laughter, which is good. She did, however, say that the shells felt rather large in her ears and that they were relatively uncomfortable compared to some regular passes, hence the technical pass. But let's jump into the important bit, which is how these sound, starting as always with the bass. The bass on the Jaws is boosted, but the texture I found was a little bit softer than I personally would like. Slim Thug's ensemble piece, Welcome to Houston, for example, sounds decent here. The low rumbly hits are actually rendered well by this driver combo, but I feel like I'm just missing a bit of that rumble that you can get with these specific hits. It's a very similar story with Peaches and Herb's Shake Your Groove thing. I feel like the bass guitar and the kick drum are present, and they sound accurate and decently well resolved, but the texture is just, I don't know, it's a little bit soft, a little bit lacking for me. It feels like the focus of this tuning is clearly not here in the low end. It's interesting considering how many dynamic drivers are in this set. The bass isn't muted, it's not rolled off, it's not, lacking in any way. It's just not as dynamic sounding as I would like. It's not disappointing, I just wish, all those dynamics in there were doing maybe a little bit more down here. The mid-range here on the Jaws is actually pretty solid. The bass isn't so boosted that it interferes with the lower mids in a tonal way, and the lower mids themselves have enough body and warmth to them that they don't feel lean, thin, or lacking to my ears. Blue Oyster Cult's Burning For You sounds pretty nice here. The bass guitar has enough presence that it doesn't get absolutely lost amongst the guitars and the distortion. The guitars and distortion sound really nice, actually. There's a little bit of a recession with some of the higher notes for the guitars and some of the keyboards, but it's not so much that I find that it ruins the replay, it's just something that I personally noticed. Female vocals are kind of interesting. Eddie Kitamura in Marshmallow Justice sounds pretty forward and quite airy. The fundamentals are emphasized well, and she sounds very forward and present, if just a touch nasally. Some of her sort of mid-range notes sound a little through the nose, if you get my meaning. Again, it's not something that outright ruins the replay, but it's something that I did notice. Overall, I would say, like the bass, I feel that the mid-range isn't the focus of this tuning, but it's still done quite well. From the moment I first started listening to the Jaws, it was immediately apparent to me that the upper mids and the treble were where the focus of this tuning lie. Female vocal harmonics exhibited a good amount of emphasis to the point where, as I mentioned earlier, they really start to affect the vocals tonally a little bit. If you're sensitive to sort of shouty or sibilant tonality, this set can have a bit of both. Britney Spears' vocals in Toxic, for example, I feel are slightly sibilant, a little bit nasal, and they have sort of a sharp edge to them. They're very emphasized, very sparkly, in my opinion, a bit fatiguing as well. The same goes for percussion and instrument harmonics on the high end. Chon's Bubble Dream, for example. That song has very consistent crash and ride cymbals throughout, and they do get fatiguing even at lower volumes. There's a lot of sparkle here, a lot of washiness, a lot of excellent stick definition on the cymbals and the hi-hats. It's a whole lot of detail, but it's right up in your face, and it can just be a little bit too much. The upper mids and treble are very detailed, they're revealing, they're sparkly, they're analytical, but for me personally, they're just too energetic. I feel like technical performance is what this IEM does best. You're kind of brute forcing it with that many drivers and crossovers and the tuning, but I mean, hey, it works. The big orchestral bass drum at the beginning of the droid invasion from the Phantom Menace is there. The quiet, sort of deeper hits are rendered quite well, and I can have a decent amount of good mallet definition coming through. It's good. As you would expect, the detail in the upper mids and treble is extremely apparent. As I mentioned, this is a very revealing set up in that range. Some of the glassware noises in Waltz for Debbie were quite sharp. No problems hearing those at all, even if I wasn't paying attention. I did have a little bit of trouble, however, making out some of the conversation in the background, but I was expecting that due to the more V-shaped nature of this tuning and the recession in the mid-range. Overall, I would say for a hybrid set, the technical performance on this ranks somewhere between the Super Mix 4 and the Performer 7. I would say it's definitely closer to the Super Mix 4, and the Super Mix 4, I think, does better with mid-range details, but this excels with that sort of top-end resolution that, in my opinion, puts it just slightly over the edge. Stereo separation and soundstage is another strong point for the Jaws. The sort of cymbal shift effect in Ted Nugent's Stranglehold comes through quite well here. It sounds nice and wide as it moves from ear to ear. It's sharp, but quite wide. The Jaws also does well with my typical sort of perceived soundstage testing tracks. Art Pepper's Star Eyes has really nice imaging. It's mastered quite well. The Jaws lets you hear all of that bass and drum detail behind you to either side with the saxophone sort of dead ahead. There's some nice room effects happening on this track from the recording studio. Overall, I would say that in terms of imaging, perceived 3D soundstage, and stereo separation, the Jaws is sort of above average considering the other IEMs at this price point. So before we do the comparisons, let's go ahead and check out the effects that impedance adapters or higher output impedance sources have on the Jaws here. If I go ahead and pull up the graphs, you can see that we have an inflection point right at around 1.5 kilohertz. Everything above that gets attenuated by a sort of increasing amount, and everything below that gets a pretty consistent boost. I'm going to be honest, I straight up prefer the Jaws with an impedance adapter. The extra bass and lower mids energy combined with the reduced treble goes a long way to making this set more palatable to me personally. If you have the Jaws and you just want to change things up, grab the Dunu 30 ohm impedance adapter. The effects will be just slightly more pronounced than the graph that I'm showing here. You will lose a little bit of that fine detail at the top end, but personally I think it's a better tuning than the stock version, and you really only lose the detail in terms of the frequency response. The drivers are still doing their thing. But without the impedance adapter, the Jaws to me comes off as a sort of bright V-shaped IEM. You've got that recession in the mids and those bright, sparkly, airy highs. Honestly, this is a pretty popular tuning, and as a result, there's no shortage of things to use in the comparison. Rather than do that, however, I've gathered what I think are some of the more interesting sets sort of in and around this price range, as well as one of its family members. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. We'll start off with a family member of the Jaws, the TRN Shell, priced at $60 US. The Shell, as I mentioned before, is essentially the same drivers as the Jaws minus those 4 balanced armatures, and personally speaking, I prefer it that way. I think TRN tuned the Jaws in such a way that you really feel those balanced armatures, and as a result, you get that sharper, metallic, thin-sounding treble as compared to the Shell, where that 6mm planar is doing most of the treble work. I don't know if it's the extra bass energy helping to balance things out, or if I'm just sensitive to BAs that are mounted in nozzles, but the Shell is just much, much more palatable to me compared to the Jaws. Can it resolve those tiny details as well as the Jaws? No. Is it as vocal forward as the Jaws? Also no. But the Shell is half the price. It also comes with a modular cable, and it isn't as fatiguing to me overall. If you're looking for sort of the ultimate in detail retrieval and technical performance in a TRN IEM, go for the Jaws. Otherwise, I personally would go with the Shell. Next up is one of the hottest new IEMs on the scene. Review coming soon. This is Zeos collab with Juzear, the Defiant, priced at $100 US. The Defiant actually has a pretty similar bass presentation to the Jaws, but that's sort of where the similarities end. The Defiant's mid-range is more filled in, much more natural sounding, and the treble, while not as sparkly or resolving as the Jaws, is in my opinion just smoother and more controlled while still having pretty good detail resolution. The Jaws has more forward vocals, but the harmonic presentation on the Defiant is much more even overall, making the vocals just sound more natural. I will have a full review of the Defiant coming up in a few videos, but just know that it's a really good set. The Jaws is definitely the more technical set, the more detailed set, but it's also more fatiguing, at least to my ears. The Defiant is just really nice overall. Next up, we have the flagship of Kinera's Celest brand of IEMs, the $170 US Relentless. I think this is actually a pretty apt comparison. The tonal balance on these two, I think, is rather similar. The Relentless is also a brighter V-shape with a recession in the mids and a good amount of treble energy, and the Jaws is the same thing. While the Relentless is also fatiguing for me personally, its fatigue is more the slow boil sort of stealth type fatigue. I can manage that with lower volumes and measuring what I listen to. It only really kicks in after longer listening sessions. I didn't get any of the same sort of metallic sharpness or BA timbre, if you will, or the graininess of the top end that the Jaws have on the Relentless. The shells on the Relentless, however, are much larger, and you don't get the same selection of ear tips as you do on the Jaws. On the other hand, the Relentless does have a modular cable, and the leather case that it comes with is nicer than the one on the Jaws. These two have similar flaws, but for me personally, with my ears, I would take the Seabird over the Shark. It's just more palatable and nicer in terms of overall tonality to me. Finally, we come to sort of a many-in-one comparison, and that's going to be any of the S12 style planar IEMs in or under this price range. I have the OG S12 here to represent this tuning, but you could go with the F1 Pro, the Klenar, the T10 Pro, the T10 Non-Pro. Any of these will work. The tunings are largely similar, as are the drivers. I know a lot of people are sensitive to what they call planar timbre, but personally, I would rather deal with an overexcited planar versus the BAs inside the nozzles. The S12, despite having a very similar tuning to the Jaws, just doesn't fatigue me the same way that the Jaws does. I do think the Jaws roughly matches the single planar in terms of overall technical performance, but the timbre of the Jaws to me just isn't as palatable or natural sounding to me as any of the S12 clones or the OG S12 for that matter. I will say, if BA timbre or the BAs in the nozzles don't bother you, and I know it doesn't bother a lot of people, this is sort of a way to get that sort of OG bright planar tuning without the planar timbre. Personally, I would rather have the full range planar with this tuning over the Jaws, but I know some people will have it the other way around. All right, let's wrap things up real quick. The Shell, a warmer, bassier version of the Jaws without the BAs at less than half the price. Pretty good value considering. Defiant, more relaxing, fuller mids, similar vocals, more controlled treble. As I said, this one's good. Full review coming. The Relentless, another bright V-shaped flagship IEM with tons of airiness and sparkle. Not as comfortable for people with small ears as the Jaws, and it is $30 more, but it tends to go on sale pretty frequently, and in my opinion, it has a much more natural tonal balance, and for some reason that the graphs don't indicate, it just fatigues me slower than the Jaws does. It just takes much longer for me to find this annoying than to find this annoying. Finally, S12 or any of the sort of bright V-shaped planars with this driver, they also have the potential to be fatiguing, but if, like me, you can handle planar timbre but not BAs in the nozzles, this is a good way to get this hyper-detailed bright sound signature without having to have BAs in the nozzles. The Jaws then, honestly, sounds kind of like a full-range bright planar, but with a different taste to the sound thanks to the Tribrid configuration as opposed to a single large planar. If you like that taste, you probably prefer this. But enough about that. Let's find out where the TRN Jaws is going to go on the Audio Amigo Arbitrary rating scale. The Jaws, to me, if I'm honest, is a bit of a confusing IEM. It's essentially a shell, but without the metal build, without the swappable nozzles, and without the modular cable. In exchange, you do get 4 BAs and more overall technical performance, but I think that does more harm than good. Something about the way those BAs sound, just their overall timbre, just feels off to me. Especially with the cymbals and the other percussions and sort of upper instrument harmonics. It doesn't sound right to me. You do end up getting what I feel is one of the most technically proficient IEMs at $130. And if that's what you're looking for, sort of an extremely revealing, technical sounding IEM, and you're willing to sacrifice some of that naturalness and timbre for it, I think this can be a good choice. For me, however, this is really hard to recommend over something like the RDT10 or the NiceHeck F1 Pro, and because of that, I think it's going to wind up in the good tier. It is a good IEM, especially in terms of its technical performance, comfort, and sort of included accessories, but it just has so many compromises for me personally to recommend it stronger than this. I will say, if you're going to be using an impedance adapter or a Rudy Rod cable, this will move up into But I Like This, as I quite like that tuning. It's much better for me. But I don't rank IEMs based on mods or impedance adapters, just their stock performance. Speaking of recommending this, let's talk about who I do and don't recommend the Jaws for. Right off the bat, if you're treble sensitive or sensitive to a sort of shouty tonality, don't go in the water. Jaws will bite you. If you're super into big boomy bass, or if you prefer a neutral tonality, you won't find either of those things here with the Jaws. The bass is good, but the sound signature isn't what I would call bass heavy. If you're looking for a very technical, revealing, bright-sounding IEM and you don't mind the BA timbre though, this might be what you're looking for. Tons of detail shoved right up in your face. That's what this thing does best. I will also say, if you're an EQ wizard and you want a sort of good collection of drivers and a 6-way crossover to play around with, this can be a really fun EQ project. Lastly, if you have a 15 ohm impedance adapter or a 30 ohm impedance adapter laying around, this gets a stronger recommendation. If you already have an impedance adapter, it turns into a nice V-shaped Tribrid set with pretty good technical performance. This is another one of those IEMs that gets better once it goes on sale. I haven't been looking too much, but I did see these get down to around $110. I will say if they drop below 100, the value proposition here improves quite considerably. But that's it. The Jaws. It's a bit of an eclectic driver combination. I think it could have been executed a little bit better. Maybe it has something to do with the 3 drivers stacked on top of each other and why I don't like the texture as much. But I do think it's a decent buy if you want just tons and tons of that top-end detail. A lot of people perceive detail up there. That's what this thing does do well. Thanks to Aoshida Audio for sending it out for review. Coming up next, we've got the Ear Acoustics SPA high-end limited edition Type 1, an IEM that feels more like jewelry than anything else, but look forward to that. For now, it's going to be it. I want to say thank you so much to everyone for watching and for all your continued support. I really hope you enjoyed the video. This has been Omar with Audio Amigo Reviews, and I will catch y'all next time.